Welcome to Raising the Bar, the podcast that pulls back the curtain on the country's most successful leaders and how they elevate their business and their teams. Please welcome our host, Alison DePauli.
Welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Keith Smith from the Oklahoma Surgical Hospital. As you know, Raising the Bar is all about how CEOs raise the bar in your businesses. And normally, we don't talk a lot about healthcare or health insurance, but my show, we're changing that today. We are going to give you a different perspective of how business affects medical care. So, Dr. Keith, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
You have such an unusual facility that we've actually had the pleasure of sending patients to. I want to ask you to start with where this idea came from.
Well, I'm an anesthesiologist and started practice in 1990. And it wasn't very long before I realized I was part of a robbery. I was part of a crime. I was enabling price gouging hospitals to financially assassinate the patients whose care was entrusted to me. And I've always been a fan of mutually beneficial exchange, and I knew I was not part of that. And that as an anesthesiologist, really as a tertiary physician, I was not able really to do anything about it other than just moan and complain, at least unless I had control of my own facility and my own institution. So that dream of being in control, not just of the medical aspect of care, but the financial aspect of care, began for me in 1992, 1993. And so there was a burnout, about to fail surgery center that I was able to buy. Actually bought it on a hunting trip. And that was the beginning of the Surgery Center of Oklahoma in 1997. We're actually celebrating our 25th year this past week.
Well, congratulations. I think you really have turned the model on its head. You've done a number of remarkable things, but I think one of the most remarkable things that you have done is publishing your pricing. So I know a number of facilities, a number of local facilities, freestanding facilities have come to talk to me about how they do that. And they're all like, well, we want to get there, but we're not sure and we don't know. And what? So it is a bit of a journey. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to do that and what some of the positive benefits of that are, and your most humorous conversation with an insurance representative about fair pricing?
Okay. Well, when we opened in 1997, we were blacklisted by all of the insurance companies. So we were out of network with everyone. And you know, I blame the insurance companies, but it's really the hospitals working with the insurance companies that creates these blacklists. Because failure to maintain some volume results in a different, worse deal for the carrier. The hospital just doesn't tolerate leakage. So we were out of network. And so we had to really sharpen our pencil and quote prices to people over the phone. And it wasn't very long before we found out the all-in, all-inclusive prices we were quoting over the phone were less than patients' in-network deductibles.
Absolutely.
So patients were coming to us, and I got pretty good at figuring out, how much should I be charging for this or that. And every time something new came up, I would just put it all together and quote that over the phone. And my staff wrote these down. And so over time, this list was created. In 2004, the state insurance commissioner in Oklahoma decided to stack deductibles. This was aimed squarely at our facility. Everything they tried to curb out-of-network business coming to us had failed, but this worked. So a patient had no out-of-network benefit until they had met and fully satisfied their in-network deductible.
Oh,
Stacking deductibles is frowned upon, if not illegal, in every other sector. But that was done to us here in Oklahoma in 2004. We had just built and occupied the beautiful, huge facility we now work in, and it almost put us out of business. And I just decided, we are cheaper, we are better. I knew we were better. Why isn't there a line out the door? Why, the free market is not at work if you're cheaper and better and you're not really busy. So I launched the website in 2009 with our all-inclusive prices. Part of it was the list that had been created over the years, quoting out-of-network patients. And then part of it was just asking surgeons, if you pick your top 10 cases that you typically do or want to do, and let's create these all-inclusive bundles and post it on the website. So in 2009, I launched the website with our all-inclusive pricing, and it really was kind of an act of defiance. We decided we wanted ourselves to be more visible and known to buyers that had sticker shock, whether they were uninsured, high deductible, members of cost-sharing ministries, members of self-funded plans. And the first thing that happened was Canadians showed up. So, so that was instructive.
Yep.
And then I met Jay Kempton, who runs the Kempton Group, and his self-funded clients had this sticker shock. And then we were fortunate to receive some early media attention, and that really launched this whole idea of price transparency in the United States. So that's sort of why I did it. I think the funniest conversation I had with an insurance exec was, I'm embarrassed to say that for a very short period of time, we actually were in network with one of the carriers.
okay.
One of the self-funded clients that came on board early wanted to do us a favor to really help us out. So they went to this carrier and told them to put us in their network, or they weren't going to do business with them anymore. So this carrier came to me, and they came into the office with my partner, Steve Lantier, and they said, well, we're here from Carrier X, and we're here to put you in the network. And I said, that's fine. Here is our pricing. And I had, the 30 sheets printed off an Excel file. And he took one look at it and he said, oh, that's way too complex for us. Yes. So that's probably the funniest conversation I've had with the exec from a carrier, but there's not many conversations to choose from because the carriers don't deal with us. They never have. That was my only exposure. And then thank God they fired us. They terminated us about 18 months later, pressured by the hospitals who saw the volume, really drop, and they didn't want to pay 90% of bill charges. So they cut us and terminated us. And Steve Lantier and I hugged for an embarrassingly long time. We were so happy to be terminated by them. It was the worst decision we've ever made.
So I'd like to give our audience a little bit of perspective here. I do have some experience with sending patients to you. And the last patient that we sent to you was a torn meniscus on a young man. If he was 18, I'm not even sure he was 18, it might've been 17. And we looked here for a facility, and the least expensive, inclusive, or almost inclusive price was about $23,000. And that would have been an outpatient surgery. And there is a freestanding surgical facility about an hour and a half from here, and the price there was a little over $14,000. So already you can see a radical difference in cash pay and insurance pricing. And then I said, you know what? Let's just check this out. And your price was $6,600 all in, with the exception of, well, you might need a brace and we pass that on to you, but we'll decide that once you've had your procedure. And the family literally drove up the day before. They had their pre-op check, they had the surgery, they stayed an extra day, and then they drove back. And they had a better experience with you than they would have at the facility here. It was more pleasant, it was more cost effective, and it was simpler. And you make things simpler, not just for patients, as is evidenced by the line out your front door, but you make things easy for surgeons because you have a line of people wanting to walk in your back door and operate in your facilities. Can you talk a little bit about how you did that?
Yeah, one of the things we decided as facility owners was that it didn't make sense to give surgeons a profit check, a dividend, kind of a shareholders amount, and also give them a payment for professional services rendered. It's just one check in one pocket, one check in the other.
Yep.
One check was the surgery center's, profitability at the end of the day. The other check was for services rendered, the professional services. To back up, when I launched the website, I knew that patients were going to just want to write one check, whether they were a Canadian or self-funded company.
Yep.
And so I operationalized a clearinghouse so that patients could just pay the clearinghouse. So I was that clearinghouse. And once I had those funds, I paid the surgeon, the anesthesia group of which I'm a part, and I paid the Surgery Center of Oklahoma as really vendors. So I had complete control of the funds when they came in, and worked with the surgeons to figure out, how much do you want? Well, it didn't take me long to figure out that I could whittle the surgery center margin down razor thin and pay surgeons a fat fee, a really handsome fee, and pay the anesthesia group a fair amount. I paid so much more than surgeons, and still do, so much more than they receive from anybody else that they deal with, that when I approach a surgeon in Oklahoma, in the Oklahoma City area, who is known for very high quality and very talented person, and I reach out to them and say, I've got a patient I'd like to send to you, and they're skeptical, and this is what they need, and yes, and well, this is what I typically pay a surgeon for that procedure. And there's always a long pause on the other end, because they really have a hard time. They really have a hard time with that. What is even more confusing to them is when I ask them, how much do you want? How much do you want to perform this procedure? And that's an even longer pause, because physicians and surgeons are used to being told, here's what you're going to accept. So over time, the surgeons get to where they trust this whole process, and they trust me. And we pay them so handsomely for what they do. And in spite of that, the prices on our website are still a fraction, as you just pointed out. So, I think we ought to pay the people who are doing the work. I know that is a radical concept in the United States healthcare system, but I really think the people doing the work, the anesthesiologist, the surgeon, the nursing staff, I think they should be well paid. And when you do that, you see what you see at my facility: smiles on every face in the building. And patients pick up on that, and it translates, I would argue, into better care.
I would agree.
Yeah, so we have 116 surgeons that work at Surgery Center of Oklahoma now, and that number could be larger, but I'm actually very picky about who I'll let come here.
So I think that speaks volumes, and you do not employ any surgeons. They are all on a contract basis, correct?
That's right. And
okay.
There are a number of reasons for that. The most important of which is easy come, easy go.
Yep.
So we've had surgeons here who, they were white hat. They were good guys. They didn't operate unnecessarily. They didn't do stupid stuff. And then they drifted to the dark side. And at that point, we just flipped their switch off and they can't come back. And so it's real easy come, easy go. The surgeons love it. If they perform well, then I refer cases to them.
Sure.
If they don't perform well, or they start to become abusive on the amount of implants that they use, then that can change just very, very easily. I also don't employ surgeons because doctors make terrible employees. It's always better when the doctor works for the patient. Whoever is paying the doctor, that's who they're accountable to.
And I want to flesh that out a little bit because we all have this idea in our minds that, well, doctors want to take care of patients. And yes, they do. But I think we're always driven by who signs our paycheck. It's why we work with employers and we're paid directly. They sign our checks. We have to work for them. And I think that the same holds through in a hospital or in a facility where either the surgeons or the physician are employees of the facility. I have some personal horror experiences of that, but I think that you see it as well. And it was your initial impetus for buying a surgical center, is doctors are not necessarily making their decisions in the interest of the patient. They're making it in the interest of the facility. And I don't think most people realize that. I think a lot of doctors don't realize that.
Yeah, and especially graduating medical students who don't know the difference. And, just if people think that this sounds harsh, here's an example. I mean, a primary care doctor who's an employee of the hospital system sees a patient who needs their gallbladder taken out. And he has two choices. He's got a surgeon who works for the hospital system who he knows is a butcher. And then he's got a choice across town who is in private practice, who makes gallbladder surgery look like child's play, just makes it look easy. What's best for that patient? Well, it's obvious what's best for that patient.
Yep.
What happens to that primary care doctor if he does what's best for the patient? Something he is not going to like. He is going to be called on the carpet by his employer, the
Absolutely.
hospital. And, that's the stuff that they use to change salary formulas and bonuses for the next quarter and the next year. So this has been referred to as moral injury. And there's a certain amount of that can happen before physicians become incredibly cynical. Because our world is kind of like a foxhole. It can be a very stressful environment, and you really need to feel like you can successfully wage battle and war for the benefit of patients. And if you feel like you can't do that, that is a very troublesome, horrible existence. But physicians need to be paid by those who they serve, the patients. And if they're working for a hospital, they are not working for the patient.
Correct. People think it's just surgery. It's not. My mother's physician used to be in a private practice, which was purchased by a hospital system. And I talk about my mother a lot because she's my mother. I can talk about her. And the doctor referred her to a cardiologist in the hospital system with a Quantro score of 27.8, which we didn't figure out until later. Then I asked him something else and he said, I can't do that because he is an employee of said hospital system.
Yeah.
I think that's atrocious. And I think people don't realize that, they don't understand it, and they don't see it. They just think the doctor is always acting in their own best interest, and sometimes they just can't.
Well, and the federal government has worked so hard to make physician ownership of facilities
A problem.
very, very difficult. And a friend of mine once said, why is it okay for hospitals to own doctors, but doctors can't own hospitals?
Yep.
And the incentive is better if the physicians own the hospital. It's not perfect, but it's better. I would argue if physicians own the facility and they are financially accountable to the patients, that's as good as it can get.
I would agree with that. And I think, good vetting processes for any provider is very helpful. And I also think that patients don't realize when they get referred, they may not get referred to the best possible provider. And the tools, at least for people like me, are getting a little bit better in helping people understand that. But people don't like to understand that, do they?
They really don't. I'm a huge fan of the direct primary care movement. I think that's probably the most revolutionary part of this free market movement. And the part of it I like the best is that primary care doctor is working for that patient.
Mm-hmm.
And they are the ombudsman. They are the guide that takes the patient across these uncertain waters where the patient really doesn't even have to know who is the best surgeon for my hernia or gallbladder. That's my primary care doctor's job.
Yep.
If I want to know who is a great surgeon to repair a cruciate ligament or to take a gallbladder out in some part of the country with which I'm not familiar, I'll call a direct primary care doctor who's boots on the ground and ask them which one of these guys would repair your hernia.
Mm-hmm.
Then you find out who's good. Everybody's consumed with data these days, and what they really want are results. And there's nothing like the experience of a primary care doctor who has guided their patients to a successful outcome. And so I'm a huge fan of the direct primary care movement because it takes a lot of steam out of the uncertainty. It takes a lot of steam out of the fear and the anxiety and the uncertainty and the doubt that patients have, wondering, is this surgeon any good?
Absolutely.
Is this who I need? Maybe I should just trust my primary care doctor who's working for me, not for some hospital system.
We just had an example of this about 2 weeks ago now. I have some clients that use DPC in their plans, and one of them went to the DPC doc, and he did in fact need to go see a surgeon. He did need an MRI first before he left the primary care's office. The MRI was scheduled, the consult with the surgeon was scheduled, and the notes had been passed on. And there was an expectation of notes coming back before anything else happened. And to me, that's what healthcare used to be. That your doctor managed your care.
That's right. And the surgeon to whom that patient was referred is less likely to operate on them if the surgery is unnecessary.
Yep.
Because he endangers the referrals in the future from that primary care doctor.
Correct.
So the incentives are aligned when no one works for a hospital. And if the surgeon works for the hospital, he gets paid on RVUs. And so the more he does, the better he does, or he's in a better position to negotiate for a better salary the next year.
Can you go back and explain what an RVU is?
Well, an RVU is something that is called a relative value unit.
Okay.
And it's downstream of the insanity that was inflicted on the system by the folks at Harvard, which is the resource-based relative value scale, RVRVS. So RVRVS, that's when the folks at Harvard decided that they could put a price on every service that a physician renders. And they knew what all those prices were because they're so smart up there. Well, top-down pricing is always wrong.
Correct.
It's either too high or too low. If it's too low, you have shortages. And if it's too high, you have surpluses. You have way too many whatever's being done, whether it's stents being placed. Whatever it is, if you're overpaying, you're going to get a bunch of it. So, of course, they got it all wrong. Well, the hospitals that started hiring all these surgeons and physicians, they realized we're not getting any work out of them because we've told them we're going to pay them all this money, and all they've done is go to the beach because they're going to get this money whether they do any work or not. So how are we going to whip them? What are we going to use to whip them into shape and make them work? Well, they came up with this RVU system, what relative value units. Well, it didn't take long for the primary care doctors to realize that they generated more relative value units by ordering tests and ordering consultations than they actually did seeing patients.
Yep.
So if you go to the average primary care doctor's office who works for a hospital system, their waiting room is empty because they figured out they can see just a handful, just 3 or 4 or 5 patients a day, and order every test in the world on them. And they generate all these RVUs as if they'd seen 40 to 60 patients in that day. So, human nature is what it is, and incentives are what they are. And all this RVU insanity is aimed at everything except patient care. It's insanity. And, we have to blame everybody involved, but the true culprit is the federal government. They have enabled this entire scam. They're always driving the getaway car whenever there's a robbery. And that's really where the buck stops. The federal government has created this entire scam. They've auctioned off our freedom and our liberty in Washington, D.C. to the highest bidder. And I would not want to bid against Big Pharma or some of these others because they're going to win at the auction every time.
I think we've seen a few examples, particularly in the pricing of our negotiation of prescription drug pricing, that Big Pharma has won. And that should be very concerning, but that might be a subject for another day. But
yeah,
but the same things that happen in pharma happen in hospital systems.
Yeah,
and hospital systems are businesses.
And it's both sides of the aisle. Bush is the one that Bush the elder is the fool who gave us the resource-based relative value scale. Bush the lesser, the younger, is the one who gave us Medicare Part D, which was a robbery, just a robbery of the American people. So it's both sides of the aisle. Everybody wants to criticize, Obamacare, and Obamacare was a tragedy. But you've got to look on the other side of the aisle too. They've not been good on this. They're legislative concubines, and they sell at an auction, and we're the victims of that. And the only answer is not to look to Washington for any kind of remedy because they caused this whole problem. The answer is a groundswell, grassroots, trust the free market, force everyone in this industry to obey and endure the same market discipline that everybody else in this country has to deal with.
What do you think about the new, well, they're not new, but the recently enacted pricing transparency requirements for hospitals and for procedures?
Well, I have mixed feelings. I'm against the government doing anything. And I had one prediction, and my friend Jay Kempton had another prediction if the government mandated price transparency, which they did.
Mm-hmm.
My prediction was that they would sell indulgences, that they would auction off exemptions, and that's exactly what they did. They just basically told hospitals, if you're not going to comply, pay the fine.
Which is a ridiculously small amount.
Hospitals just paid the fine, which in my mind is just selling exemptions or selling indulgences.
And the fine is incredibly small, by the way.
Yes.
It's not anybody, it's not a fine that would, I'm not even sure it would bother me, and I'm not a hospital system.
Yeah. And then Jay Kempton predicted the other thing that would happen, and that is that there would be an attempt to redefine price transparency.
Yep.
And that was very successful. The insurance carriers have now redefined price transparency to be what is the patient's out of pocket.
Correct.
So Jay predicted that, I predicted the other. Both those things have happened. And then the current occupant of the White House made it worse by increasing the fines and increased the fines so high that it has caused a consolidation.
Yes.
So and this is the way regulations work. The people being regulated write the regulations, and it's the big dogs who pay big money to have a seat at the regulatory table.
Correct.
And they just regulate all their smaller competitors out of business. So the current administration saw an opportunity and they worked with the big giant hospital systems to make those fines big. And so now you have all these smaller hospitals that struggle with the concept of price transparency,
let alone the execution.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's not that they don't want to do it. They're just uncertain about how to implement it. And then you have these giant hospital systems that pay the giant fines, and they don't really care. That the reason I have mixed feelings about all this is that it changed the narrative. So the tinfoil hat put on my head for posting these all-inclusive prices on the web, that hat came off. And so now when a patient goes to a hospital and says, how much is a laparoscopic assisted vaginal hysterectomy? How much is a tonsillectomy? How much is a cochlear implant? When the hospital will not answer that question, they're the weirdos. They're the ones that have to account. So I have mixed feelings about the government mandating anything. Most of the time I'm against government doing anything because they make everything worse. But this executive order that Trump signed mandating price transparency has changed the narrative, I would say, in a good way, because now the American people expect an answer when they ask the price question.
Yes, it is. I was talking with a client of mine last week, and they were all outraged at a facility in their small town that is a freestanding facility that bills them egregiously and will not disclose their pricing ahead of time. So we had to find a solution for them. And those were painters. So we're talking about everyday, ordinary people who understand what things that you should know what something costs. And I think that's really important and a great change. Before we wrap up, I want to ask you a little bit about your mentorship and engagement of medical students, because I think that is something that you've done that can really move the needle towards more localized healthcare with a primary care doctor in charge, because I think that's one of the big problems we have is we don't have enough primary care doctors, right? Because they have no control, they're getting squeezed on every side, and your aim is to change that.
Yeah, and my only regret is that I didn't push harder for this years ago, but I'm helping with a Benjamin Rush Institute chapter here in Oklahoma. I'd encourage anybody watching this to search out Benjamin Rush Institute and make a donation.
We'll link in the show notes.
Yeah, this is the outfit that works hard to make sure medical students know there is a path other than hospital employment. So we are having meetings here at the Surgery Center of Oklahoma. We had 26 medical students at our last meeting. That would make it one of the largest chapters in the country, and we're just kind of getting started. Jay Kempton and I personally sponsored 8 students to attend the Free Market Medical Association conference you were at in Fort Worth.
Yep, and they asked a ton of questions of all kinds of people. It was amazing.
Yeah, and my message to the medical students is always the same. Whatever you do, do not go to work for a hospital, because it's just a matter of time before you have that conflict of interest no physician should ever face. What is best for me versus what is best for this patient?
Yep.
And we're getting a lot of traction with them. Their eyes are open. Medical schools nowadays in the United States are very woke, very intolerant places. So, the Benjamin Rush Institute and the the meetings we have at Surgery Center of Oklahoma are kind of a safe space, and they can speak their mind and they can ask questions. There's no pre-approved narrative, the violation of which puts somebody in jail. So it's a very healthy environment, and my only regret is I didn't really push harder many years ago to help students avoid the bad path. I brought a banker in to the first meeting, and the banker said, "Why don't you rent your soul to me instead of selling it to a hospital?"
I loved that when you
The banker said, "You pay me off and I disappear." And hospitals they know how this game works, and they make it very, very difficult for someone to leave employment if they decide that's what they want to do.
Absolutely. What would be your best advice for a consumer, a person in seek of medical care moving forward after listening to this episode?
If somebody listening to this, it does not have a relationship with a direct primary care doctor, that's where I would start. Because everything else kind of falls into line once you have a knowledgeable guide who's boots on the ground, who knows the terrain, they know the quality of anybody they would refer you to. And they also have access to pricing if you have sticker shock.
Yep.
So anybody who is Medicare age, they need to find a direct primary care doctor and pay them the $80 or $90 a month and just do that and forget about, well, does Medicare cover this? And this revolution will continue to grow. And this medical industry, of which I'm a part, will increasingly be accountable to those who ought to be paying us.
What is your best advice for an employer who wants to change how they engage with the healthcare system for their staff?
So an employer should be self-funded if they can. That's my first recommendation. And then they always need to at least entertain the idea that their broker is lying to them, particularly if they are not paying the broker. Mm-hmm. If the broker or consultant is paid by one of the big carriers, then we revert back to the 10-minute mark in this show of whose bread I eat, his song I must sing. So whoever is paying the broker or consultant is who is the boss man. He is the one giving the orders. So an employer needs to work with their CFO, and they need to explore, and they need to allow their human resource department to experiment and to fail, try new things, even if the broker or consultant is against it, maybe particularly if the broker or consultant is against it. One of the techniques I've seen brokers and consultants use is, well, that may be a good idea, but this is not the time for it. And so this delay, yep. And fear and uncertainty and doubt and all those things. So if you're an employer, you should seriously consider self-funding. And then you should always wonder, is there another way? Why are we not trying something else? Because the results are in. Jay Kempton's clients, with an average number of belly buttons at 18,000 lives since 2012, have saved $130 million just by using Surgery Center of Oklahoma. So
I'm not surprised at all.
In 10 years, they've saved between $10 and $15 million a year as a group by making that decision. So unless healthcare is a rounding error for your company, and most of the time it's not, then it's time to look at direct contracting. It's time to involve direct primary care as part of your health plan. It's time to to really find an independent TPA and not use a carrier that has gross conflicts of interest. It's time to understand and read about reference-based pricing. It's time to look at some options because the carriers that are acting as the ASO on a self-funded plan, they do not have the best interests of the plan at heart.
Thank you. And we're going to leave it there. You heard it from somebody else besides me today. So, Dr. Smith, thank you very much for joining us today. For those of you listening, if you like this episode, please give it a like, give it a share, leave us a review. It helps us spread the word, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Raising the Bar is powered by Altiqe Consulting, the country's leading independent expert in healthcare cost containment. Astute employers know there's a better way to offer health insurance, and we help them achieve it.